And we're back talking about nuclear power and whether or not it's a good potential energy source for Canada going forward. Chatting with Dr. Chris Keefer, he's one of the co-founders of Canadians for Nuclear Energy. Dr. Keefer, you had mentioned before the break about how there's never been any issues with the handling of spent fuel from nuclear reactors, but we have seen problems with nuclear power plants, whether it be Chernobyl, Fukushima, and others. Um, do we need to be concerned in Canada about any of our facilities and the way that they're structured right now and having potentially similar issues?
hmm I mean, so I live within about 50 kilometers of the Pickering nuclear station. That's six large Candy reactors. I'm raising my family here. I have no concerns. I've visited the plant. I feel very safe. In terms of accidents that have
Hmm.
happened around the world, certainly Chernobyl is the outlier. So this was run in the midst of pretty terrible Soviet bureaucracy, which led to some very poor decision making and a reactor design which had no containment. This is the only nuclear accident that resulted in significant morbidity and mortality to people not working at the station itself. And that's tragic. We saw a number of
Hmm.
children in particular who got thyroid cancer, again, because there was not containment around this reactor. The accidents outside of the Soviet Union, 3 Mile Island, for instance, the maximum dose that anyone of the public got was less than a chest X-ray of radiation. So really, there's no health impacts from that. And Fukushima, there was a bit more of a radiation release, but the Japanese managed that very, very well. And the UN anticipates that there'll be no cancers or other health effects from radiation. So people heard 20,000 people died because of Fukushima. That wasn't because of Fukushima. That was because of the earthquake and the tsunami.
Hmm.
Canada has what I believe is the world's safest nuclear reactor in the form of the Canada reactor. It has many, many, many features that make it that way, including just a lot of available water for cooling. 12 days of
Hmm.
passive cooling, which is a factor that did not exist in Japan and with these other reactors.
It's an awful thing to have to bring up, but it's the world that we live in. We have seen terrorist attacks in different forms. There's always this fear out there that maybe terrorists could get their hands on some of the spent fuel, or maybe before it's even used. Is that have we prepared adequately in Canada to make sure that we have the security in place at these sites for those types of potential incidents?
For sure. And I'd say after 9/11, security was amped up, particularly in the States, but also in Canada. There are highly professional security forces there. I mean, the idea that terrorists are going to be able to come in and open up or transport a dry fuel container that weighs hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tons and handle that
Hmm.
radioactive material without harming themselves it's a big stretch of the imagination. And it's interesting the way human psychology works there. We like these kind of fantastical, dramatic threats, but often what we ignore are
Yeah.
things like the everyday pollution from fossil fuels. So in Ontario, we use nuclear for 90% of the energy required to phase out coal completely from our grid. Coal used to result in 1,000 premature deaths every year, tens of thousands of excess hospitalizations. So there's kind of a silent enemy that doesn't make for great television or an HBO series. But it's an example of where nuclear has actually saved thousands and thousands of lives right here in Canada. It has the potential to do that in provinces that are still burning coal, like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Nova Scotia.
Well, you mentioned these huge canisters that contain the spent fuel. I've seen them. They weigh tons and tons. They're made of huge, vast amounts of concrete. I guess you're not pulling up in an F-150 and throwing one of these things in the back of your truck. One thing we haven't talked about yet, is the potential of nuclear power. Uh, how much uranium is there for Canada to shift to this fuel source for a long period of time, and also even maybe the world?
Yeah, I mean, so Canada is set. We have, again, the richest uranium deposits in the world. An ore grade of 1% is considered quite good around the world. We have ore deposits as high as 20% and little patches in the ore that are 60%. We have all the uranium we would ever want. It's actually Canada's number one clean energy export. We export and use enough uranium domestically to offset over 250 tons of CO2, sorry, megatons of CO2 every year. And that's one third of Canada's total all sector emissions. In terms of long-term anxieties, if the whole world were to embrace nuclear more, certainly, if you start looking, you find more uranium, and we have found that. There was thoughts that uranium was quite constrained back in the 60s, but there's also
Mhm.
options like extracting it from seawater, and there's a number of reactor technologies that can use spent nuclear waste as a source of fuel. So there's still a lot of uranium out there and a lot of potential there.
Well, it's all very interesting. We'll be back in a few minutes to chat more about nuclear power in Canada.